In John chapter 8, verses 31 and 32, Jesus said, "Abide in my word, and you will be my disciples indeed. And you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free." It's this word free that caused Jesus' audience a little consternation. They said, "We are Abraham's seed, and we have never been in bondage. We've never been enslaved. How is it then, Jesus, you say we will be made free?" The irony of this statement is the fact that the Israelite nation was born out of bondage. As you know, they were in Egypt for 400 plus years before God delivered them through Moses from slavery, from bondage. And every year thereafter, the Passover feast was a celebration and a reminder of the fact that they were delivered from bondage. Notwithstanding Egyptian freedom, we remember that in 722 BC, the 10 northern tribes were carried away by Assyria into captivity, never to return. A few years later, in 606 BC, the 2 southern tribes of Judah were also carried away by Babylon and King Nebuchadnezzar into slavery. They were then passed off to the Medes and Persians. And although they returned home after 70 years under the reign of the Persian King Cyrus, they were never a free people. The Greeks ruled the world at that point, and then the Romans. So even when Jesus is speaking in John chapter 8, the children of Israel have no king of their own. In fact, they are paying taxes to another. They're paying taxes to Caesar, and the Romans are under control. You cannot read the Old Testament without reading about the prophets predicting bondage. You cannot help but read the Psalms, which refer to the captivities. And you read of the prophets that were in captivity, like Ezekiel, who was a priest that was a prisoner of war. Or Daniel, although he was in the palace, he was still a part of the captivity. And then there are the post-exilic prophets, the prophets that preach after the exile, who help Israel restore its state, that imply they were in captivity. Now, the way the story of Israel should have ended was like this. And Israel returned from captivity after 70 years, a renewed nation, a restored nation. And they obeyed God and lived by faith and lived happily ever after. Unfortunately, that is not the way the story ends. In fact, if you've read the Old Testament, you know that Israel did not get better. Yes, there were glimpses of hope. There were bright spots in their history where they obeyed God. But from Ezra to Nehemiah to Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, these prophets, although they do tell us about those good moments, they really highlight the fact that Israel did not come back from captivity a people with hearts that were penitent. Well, people with hearts that yearn to follow God. Ezra tells us in Ezra 7 and verse 10 that he had prepared his heart to seek the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach its statutes and ordinances in Israel. Israel by itself was not inclined to pick up the law and to follow it. Ezra had to help those people along. Now, there are good moments in Ezra where they begin to build the temple. And Ezra begins to restore worship and the law, as he is a contemporary of Nehemiah. We read that great text in Nehemiah chapter 8 where Ezra gets on the platform and reads the law. Nehemiah also highlights another positive mark in Israel's history, as he is the cupbearer for King Artaxerxes, the husband of Queen Esther, another great Bible story. He returns to Israel, to Jerusalem, to rebuild the walls. And in 52 days, he rebuilds that wall that was over 2 miles long, 12 feet wide, 35 feet high. In 52 days, because the people had a mind to work. Now, this is all good news. This is all very positive and hopeful progress, but it's not the end of the story, because we find 16 years later, Haggai and his contemporary Zechariah have to come to the children of Israel because they did not finish building the temple. For 16 years, the foundation laid there. Instead, they decided to build themselves nice, fancy homes. In Haggai chapter 1 and verse 2, the prophet says, and he's quoting the people, "The time has not come that the Lord's house should be built." So Haggai says in verse 4, if it's not time to do God's work, then what time is it? Is it time for you to sit in your nice, fancy, luxurious, paneled homes, reclined? Consider your ways, verse 6. Consider your ways. How has your investment in self paid off? He says, you have food, but not enough. You have drink, but not enough. You have clothes, but not enough. In fact, the text goes on to say that the heavens withhold its due because God is not blessing his children at this point. Consider your ways. You're like a man who takes his wages and puts them into a bag with holes. That's not a good investment because there's no return. Build the temple. So the people rise up and build the temple. Maybe the children of Israel have got their act together this time. No, the prophet Zechariah, a contemporary of Haggai, shares the visions that God had given to him for the children of Israel to repent, to build the temple. Although they built the temple, Jesus says something interesting in Matthew 23 and verse 35. He says that Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, was murdered between the altar and the temple. And everything just spiraled downhill as we get to the book of Malachi, and God is disgusted with their worship. He is disgusted with their sacrifices. He says, you are offering me things you wouldn't even give your pagan governor. Just shut the doors of the temple. The priests corrupt. The people corrupt. They had even denied that God even loved them. Malachi says you won't hear from God or from his prophets again until you hear the voice of the one crying in the wilderness, the one that will make straight the way of the Lord. And that, of course, is John the Baptist. And so for a few hundred years, there is silence from God. We have one more lesson on the story of Israel before we move into the story of Jesus. A lot of things take place during that period of silence that we want to talk about that will help us understand the period of time that Jesus lived in. See you next time.